Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 8 of our coverage of the 2016 Canada's tournament. Winner of this tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship. Our two competitors today are the two Americans in the field, Fabiano Caruana playing the white pieces and Nakamura playing the black pieces. With the World Championship in the United States, New York, later in November, it would be pretty cool if an American did win. But both these players really need a victory. Can't really have a draw or a loss anywhere for the rest of the tournament, or they're essentially out, always depending on how their opponents do. But you can't have all your opponents lose. They are going to beat each other. So wins are very essential. Fabiano has tied every match so far, so he hasn't lost, which is good, but ties only get you so far. He has 3.5 points through 7 rounds. Nakamura has 3 points through 7 rounds. He did get a very crucial win last round. If he could string 2 wins together, that would be very huge. But we'll go ahead and get started with Fabiano, starting with pawn e4. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. This is the right Lopez. We've been seeing more and more of this lately. And for the last year, it seems like everyone is just playing the same Berlin defense. Knight f6. Later half of last year, we would see a lot of castle on the king side, knight take e4, and then pawn d4. This is pretty common. It seems like in this tournament, at least, we've been seeing a lot more of just pawn to d3, which is what Caruana plays. Nakamura responds with bishop c5. Bishop takes here on c6 after the pawn recaptures, then knight to d2. And this kind of came up in round 1 with Vishy Anand, but the knight can't take this pawn on e5. It does kind of look like it's hanging out there, but after knight takes on e5, then queen down here, d4 is just deadly. It threatens mates right here on f2. It doesn't matter how kind of defends this, whether it's queen to e2, castle on the king side, either way, this knight's going to fall. Black is just up, way too much material, controls the center of the board. White has no minor pieces developed in the center. This is going to be a pretty easy game for black to dominate. So on board instead we see knight to d2, getting ready to come c4, then have double attackers on the e5 square. So this is kind of the plan. And then once he has knight c4, this also opens up the door for the dark square bishop on board. So castle on the king side, queen e2. Rook e8, just adding more protection. Knight c4, as we talked about, opening up the door for the dark square bishop. Adding another attacker on pawn e5. So we see knight come back here. d7, another defender on this pawn e5. And then bishop d2. And then bishop back here to d6. So Nakamura is kind of overloading on this pawn. Doesn't need necessarily all those pieces, but also recognizing that the bishop on c5 isn't really attacking anything too productive right now. Now Fabiano has 2 decisions because he kind of played this bishop here to d2. He's done a good job of getting all of his pieces developed. He can castle on the king side or the queen side. Now if you kind of look at it and say in one specific match on random opponent, I would generally recommend just castling on the king side. I think white has a very good game if you castle on the king side. He has a good pawn structure going towards the late game. Queen side is a lot more aggressive, though, and as we kind of saw from the last match with Nakamura and Topolov, you get to a stage in the tournament, round 8 is definitely that stage, where it's no longer good enough to tie. You know that you need some wins, and so while you see cautious players early on, we're kind of in that stage where you're going to see a lot more aggression, and so Fabiano decides to go and castle on the queen side. Anytime you have one side castle on the king side, the other side castle on the queen side, it's usually just fireworks. One side just throws their kitchen sink on one side, the other player tries to kind of hold up as much as possible and then attack on the other side. Nakamura immediately starts to attack on the queen side, pawn b5, knight comes back here, e3, pawn a5, knight f5. So starting to attack on the king side for Fabiano, that is. Pawn a4, just trying to extend. He has a really good extension of space over here on the queen side, just trying to push as much of his pieces over here on the queen side, try to overload this white king right here. Bishop g5, forcing kind of pawn f6. Later on, this does open up the door for these light squares to have an attack on the king. Nakamura should look to kind of play king h8 just to have a more secure king. So we'll kind of look for that later in the game. Bishop back here to e3. it's probably much weaker to just go ahead and take. So knight takes on d6. All of a sudden, pawn retakes. No longer has the double pawns. Then bishop e3, a3. This is probably just not as good for white. Black has a really strong attack right here. So instead of giving up that knight, decides to go ahead and bring the bishop back here to e3 first. Now knight c5, pawn up here to g4. So Fabiano recognizing he needs to start to attack a little bit himself over here on the king side. Bishop e6, really putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on a2. Could have even, if he wanted to, push forward pawn a3, I think makes a lot of sense. He's kind of looking at it and says he doesn't necessarily want just pawn b3, which is fine. And so instead decides to go ahead and play bishop here to e6 first. Now king to b1, b3 kind of loses to pawn takes here, and then it kind of just blows up the protection from the pawns. Now pawn to b4, just pushing a little further. Pawn g5, now pawn b3, and things get pretty interesting as far as how we really defend this from white's perspective. And you could also try a3, but then kind of that b3 I think is a little easier for Fabiano to hold on to. So Nakamura, I think, plays it correctly and plays pawn b3. Now rook g1 just needs to make sure that he has some sort of counterattack at all. And then pawn takes here on a2, king over here a1. Definitely would be a mistake. Can't take right here on a2, but to try to go over here, c1, you can tell, just going to get a queen right here on a1. So really only option is king a1. Now the bishop takes on f5, and you can see that that bishop was protecting this pawn on a2. So keep that in mind. Now the king can freely take if he wants to. Now after the pawn takes on f5, now pawn to a3. But pawn to a3 makes it a lot more tricky, because if the king were to take on a2, it gets pretty crazy. The pawn takes on b2. If the king takes, then all of a sudden queen to b8, and black has a mating threat in just a handful of moves. There's no way for white to really stop this. So although the bishop left the e6 square, Nakamura definitely had a plan to still kind of have a strong attack and have this pawn on a2 defended, even though it's not necessarily by a direct piece. Now we kind of looked at what would happen if the king takes here on a2, but it'd also be a mistake for the pawn to take here on a3, because knight to a4 is pretty deadly. It sets up for the bishop to take here on a3, also sets up for the knight to come to c3, forking both the queen and the rook here on d1. There's not a lot of great squares that white can really do to protect this, and this kind of blows up this queen side of the board. All of a sudden the queen can come over here to b8, get very involved into the game if he needs to. There's just no protection anymore in front of the king. So Nakamura recognizes this, or Fabiano recognized this, plays pawn to b3, much better defense, and then knight to a6, preparing for knight b4. Now, I much would rather play king h8, see what my opponent does. King h8, make sure that there's no shenanigans later on with the queen controlling this light square diagonal. It gains a tempo after I have to move my king out of check, but decides instead to play knight here to a6, preparing for knight down here to b4. Now pawn to c3, Fabiano, as you can imagine, immediately recognizes that and thwarts that attack, playing pawn c3. Now bishop back here f8, we do see knight d2, and then after the pawn takes, rook captures here on g5, the knight comes back here to c5. So Nakamura used a couple moves and didn't really do too much with his knights here on c5. Now the rook's going to come back at g3, and then we have one of the more questionable moves definitely in the game so far, and that is pawn to e4. Now we kind of look at it and say, before this, Nakamura, he's up a pawn, so he has 7 pawns to his opponent's 6, although his pawns are pretty terrible. He has 2 double pawns on the a file, which those you can almost count as 1.5 maybe. You have 2 pawns, double pawns on the c file. That's not a good pawn structure. You have an isolated pawn here on the e file. That's not that great, but he is up material, and all of a sudden pawn to e4 is just bad. It just gives up material for no reason. It essentially gives up one of your powerful pieces that you have an attack with for no reason. So after pawn e4, bishop takes on c5, bishop recaptures, and then knight to e4. White now has a very aggressive knight in the center of the board, can't really be attacked because of the starch for a bishop, can't attack it, and white gained that material. So all in all, pretty questionable move for Nakamura. Not really sure what he was going for. Bishop back here to d6, rook h3, starting to attack on the king side. Bishop e5. That's just going to be stopped by pawn d4. Bishop comes back here to f6. You can start to see all the attacks that Nakamura was going for. Fabiano's done a good job of kind of stopping them, and then over time just started to chip away at some of the material. Nakamura no longer has a lot of the great material that he would like to go ahead and attack his opponents. Now rook to g1, Fabiano starts to kind of counterattack, starts to put a lot of pressure on the king side of the board. Now rook b8. Met by king takes on a2, so just gobbling up more material on board. Bishop h4, it is being protected by the queen, so the rook can't take it now. That's going to be a mistake. But a rook up here to g4, so essentially the bishop is going to have to come back and retreat, or just the rook's going to take it and the queen can't recapture. Instead, Nakamura decides for one last hoorah, queen down here to d5, and then pawn to c4. This is going to thwart the queen to move, and then this bishop is going to fall. So in this particular spot, Nakamura is forced to resign and essentially giving up any hope that he goes on to win the tournament. So congratulations to Fabiano Caruana. He kind of catapults himself. He's only half a point off from the lead. So for those players out there hoping for someone from the United States to win this tournament, there is still hope. We still have kind of the leaders up top with Levano Ronian and Sergei Karyakin. They are still up there with 5 points. So everyone playing well so far. All the other games were a draw, just so you can kind of keep up with all of the action. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this match, and I'll see you guys in the next one for round 9.